Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know what to call you. Troglodytes, I think. If you don't know what those are, troglodytes are cave dwellers. Most people are outside today. I'm so gratified that you're happy to be inside. We are very pleased to have you here. A number of us in the crowd here have spent a lot of the day discussing various issues connected to the sex abuse scandal. And we're ending our program with a public lecture. We, by the way, were inside for approximately 5 hours in a room with no windows. So this is an improvement. So, thank you for being here. My name's Paul Lakeland. I direct the Center for Catholic Studies. We're very happy to have you here, and we're even happier to have Peter Steinfels here to talk on the topic of the sex abuse scandal, what's next. Many of you, I'm sure, know Peter or know his work, so I'm going to keep the introduction brief. For those of you who don't know him, he was at one time co-director of the Fordham University Center on Religion and Culture. He lives in New York City. He had his doctorate from Columbia. He joined the staff of Commonweal, then and now the premier Catholic journal of opinion in the United States. If there are fans of America Magazine here, they can keep quiet. He also served as editor of Commonweal for about, was it 5 years, something like that? Yeah. And subsequently worked as religious affairs correspondent for the New York Times. Had a column called Beliefs for about 20 years, I think. Peter is the author of a number of books, two in particular I know of, one called Neoconservatives, The Men Who Are Changing America's Politics. We may be due for a new edition there. And more recently, A People Adrift, The Crisis of the Roman Catholic Church in America. The copy of Commonweal we gave out to you when you came in case you haven't seen it before, which is unlikely for many of you, contains a very long article Peter wrote a few weeks back now, challenging at least some of the dimensions of the Pennsylvania grand jury report on sex abuse in 6 Pennsylvania dioceses. I'm not sure what direction he will take things today, but we will shortly find out. So Peter will talk for about 45 minutes, I guess, and then afterwards we will have a brief response. So our respondent will be Michelle Dillon, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of New Hampshire, also the author of several books, and most recently, I think last year, a book that I can thoroughly recommend to you called Post-Secular Catholicism. Michelle Dillon. So, without more ado, Peter Steinfels to talk about sex abuse, the church and the sex abuse scandal. What's next? Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to see that everybody chooses on a beautiful spring afternoon to come and speak and listen to a discussion of the sex abuse crisis. Nothing better. Here is a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to remove it, so this is your very brief chance to memorize it, and you'll know where we're going from there. There's nothing wrong with saying the obvious. We need to hear victims, we need healing, we need accountability, transparency, and into clerical culture, or to chancery culture, as my wife tends to describe it, to episcopal immunity. We need a re-examination of celibacy and a fresh theology of sexual fidelity. Many of these things and others were said in the discussions that we've held already today. And to me, these things are obvious. And being obvious does not make them any less true or any less important to repeat and underline. I'm often grateful to hear the obvious affirmed, especially if it's something that I believe is obvious. But I hope you will be grateful if I go in another direction. While I want to set before you a number of things obvious about the sexual abuse crisis, I also want to raise some questions. Questions for which the answers, to me anyway, are not at all obvious. Questions, to be frank, that make me nervous, uncomfortable, sometimes even a little fearful. My starting point is the familiar quotation from F. Scott Fitzgerald. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. I know that you are all first-rate intelligences here, so here are three opposed, though not necessarily contradictory, ideas. First of all, breaking news and old news. If the scandal were not breaking news, we would not all be here today on such a beautiful spring day. The sex abuse crisis is constantly reported in the present tense. An epidemic is engulfing the church. Attorney generals are uncovering hidden abusers and decades of cover-up. And there is no denying that the pain and devastating impact of those of abuse on victims remains a very present reality. At the same time, for the United States, and I know much more about the United States and little about the church in other parts of the world, at least on a level that would make me feel confident in speaking about them. For the United States, though not necessarily the rest of the world, this is breaking news or re-breaking news about things that happened 30 to 50 years ago. As a journalist, I started following the sex abuse scandal closely in the late 1980s. I remember James Porter, who abused perhaps 100 children, both as a Massachusetts priest in the 60s, and then as an ex-priest and married father in Minnesota afterwards. I remember when Porter was exposed on TV's Primetime Live, hosted by Diane Sawyer. That was 1992. In June 1993, I wrote that the clergy abuse scandal was, quote, a biblical plague with possibly 100,000 victims. I wrote that on the front page of the New York Times Sunday Week in Review section. That was almost a decade before the Boston Globe's well-known exposés. One examination of nearly 700 cases in the Pennsylvania grand jury report that specified the years of abuse found that the average year when the abuse alleged ended was 1979, 40 years ago. As for cover-ups, credible allegations have been routinely reported to law enforcement since 2002, in many dioceses since the early or mid-1990s. The John Jay College of Criminal Justice study of Catholic clergy sex abuse found a spike in abuse between the late 1960s and the late 80s. And here are some important graphs that illustrate this precipitous decline. Some of what is seen as the spike is not, to my mind, yet satisfactorily explained. But I think equally we have to seek an explanation for the figures down here, the precipitous decline and what has followed afterwards. Of course, as you know, there's a delay in reporting abuse on an average sometimes around 20 years. And at the time that the figures in the pattern in the graph I just showed were publicly announced after their first study, it was assumed that later allegations that would come to the fore would show later post-2002 abuse. But in fact, that turned out not to be the case. Not in every case, but by and large, the later allegations followed the same pattern as the earlier ones. They were reporting abuse that had occurred in those early years. And this shows the pattern up until 2013. These are incidents as percentages, not absolute numbers of the total from 1950 to 2012, and you can see the same pattern there. So breaking news and old news. Can we keep those two opposed ideas in our minds at the same time? Second, Catholic cluelessness and cultural cluelessness. I have often excoriated in writing church officials for a stubborn cluelessness extending well into the 80s and early 90s. Cluelessness about the grave harm to victims and the compulsive refractory character of predators. And I would stand by what I have written. But I have become increasingly aware of our entire culture's cluelessness about sex abuse. First of all, of course, the silence that's been long imposed by popular sexual taboos, especially involving same-sex acts. But equally, the views once widely held by social workers, psychotherapists, and law enforcement officials. If the church was blinded by a clericalism and moralism that discounted allegations and sent offenders off to make retreats, therapists were often blinded by a Freudian legacy of considering allegations to be sexual fantasies. Social workers focused either on incestuous fathers in the family or lurking strangers outside it. They overlooked relatives, step-parents, boyfriends, and professionals, including the clergy, who were welcomed into the home. A 1988 volume put together by the American Bar Association and the National Institutes of Mental Health lamented the lack of awareness that doctors, teachers, and other professionals might abuse children, and that the pertinent regulatory bodies, which were both civil and professional in their licensing activities, typically viewed such allegations, and I quote, with the tendency to excuse, make exceptions, blame the victims, and or minimize the consequences of the assault. Sound familiar? Abuse literature used in the 1980s held that the harm to victims from abuse itself was apt to be less than the harm done by major therapeutic or legal interventions. Cluelessness, the church's special brand, but also the culture's and the professionals. Remember both. Finally, trial and history. Journalism is said to be the first draft of history. I confess to having habitually and deliberately committed journalism, both alone and with others, for many decades. I was also academically trained in the study of history, so I have an inner historian bursting to get out. Without determined journalists and the media, the sex abuse scandal would still be cloaked in darkness. It is also true that the great bulk of what journalists have revealed has emerged from lawsuits, criminal investigations, trials, charges, depositions, testimony, competing lawyers, and now state investigations. There's a very valuable book called Holding Bishops Accountable, written by Timothy D. Litton. Litton is not a Catholic or a journalist or an activist in the abuse scandal. He is a legal scholar out to show how civil suits for damages, as in the paradigmatic case of lung cancer victims suing tobacco companies, can be engines not only for compensating injured individuals, but of bringing about social change. In his book, Litton brilliantly shows how the storytelling needs of plaintiffs for abuse victims and the media converged in framing the abuse scandal as, I quote him, a morality tale about right and wrong, a stark conflict between victims and a guilty, self-serving institution. In this story, bishops fully knowledgeable about the threat to children shuffled or shuttled them predatory priests from parish to parish in order to protect the priest's or the church's reputation. Was that framework always and necessarily false? Absolutely not, by no means. Was it seriously incomplete? Yes, I'm convinced it was. A trial is not a history. The trial of Louis XVI was not a history of the French Revolution. The Nuremberg trials, however necessary, were not a history of the Germany that produced Nazism. Exploring that history led historians back to Luther and forward to Prussia, Bismarck, World War I, the Versailles Treaty, the Great Depression, and so on. In my view, the dominant narrative of the sex abuse scandal has been framed by litigation to the neglect of many other actors and factors that, unlike the bishops or religious orders, have not been realistic sources of the kinds of compensation that victims understandably seek. In this sense, we do not have a real history of the sex abuse scandal. Do we need one? I think so. Do we want one? Right now, I think most of us prefer a trial. We know about the crimes and we want the accused, bishops even more than pathetic predators, identified, tried, convicted, and punished. The impulse is understandable. The verdict of a court is definitive, guilty or not guilty, and it is personal. The verdict of historians is much more likely to be diffuse and often structural. The first-rate intelligence doesn't substitute the one for the other. I'd like to move on to the changed context in which we find ourselves today. When I wrote the introduction to my book, A People Adrift, The Crisis of the Roman Catholic Church in America, I began with a sentence that I hoped would be an alarm bell. Quote, "Today, the Roman Catholic Church in the United States is on the verge of either an irreversible decline or a thoroughgoing transformation." That book was published in 2003. where are we now? Can we say that the church has undergone a thoroughgoing transformation? If so, it somehow slipped by me unnoticed. I will not get into what it might mean to say that the church in the United States is in irreversible decline. After all, actuarially speaking, I am in a pretty irreversible state of decline myself. Let's merely say that the church is critically fragile. That doesn't mean an absence of sanctity, sacrifice, and social witness. Millions worship each weekend. There are dazzling and humbling examples of Catholic vitality, regional expansion, and creative initiatives. On Tuesday evening, I spoke with a pastor of a church in Flushing, Queens, where 5,000 people worship each weekend in 4 different languages, and 51 people will be presenting themselves for sacraments at Easter time. But unfortunately, there are numbers that are also there. The slipping proportion of the American population that calls itself Catholic, and most telling of all, the hemorrhaging of the next generations from the pews. Parishes are folding and merging, schools closing, budgets shrinking, priests and sisters aging. Anyone familiar with the lives of young people from middle school to graduate school know how frail the catechesis of the church can be compared to the catechesis of the culture. I mention fragility because there is often an assumption that the church is a very powerful institution politically, organizationally, financially, and in its influence over its own members. It is an impression widespread among people of my age. The church, for them, for us, can take a lot of body blows and still bounce back. It is an impression, I submit, that can prevent us from taking the true measure of the sex abuse crisis. In 2003, the year my ominous sentence about decline or transformation appeared in print, the sex abuse crisis had been upon us for over a decade. I believed then, and I believe now, that the principles and accompanying mechanisms set up by the 2002 Dallas Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People were a great leap forward in addressing the scandal. And pardon me if I briefly review those principles and mechanisms. Zero tolerance, all substantiated offenders removed from active ministry, regardless of the date of abuse or outcome of any treatment they might have undergone. Prompt investigation of allegations and suspension of the accused pending the result. Establishment of lay majority boards to review evidence and recommend action. Outreach and assistance to victims with a well-publicized office to receive complaints and coordinate a pastoral response. Full cooperation with law enforcement and civil authorities. Extensive background checks of all church personnel and educational programs on sex abuse for parents and for children. A national lay-led office overseeing regular audits of diocesan observance of all these measures. But we need to look at several developments since that time. First, if you will, a non-development development. What the church has not done. It has failed to meet a whole series of challenges. Each of us may have a different list. from liturgy and preaching to religious education to political action to the roles of women and the laity to the shortage in character of priests to teachings on sexual morality. These challenges are distinct from the sex abuse scandal, yet the scandal has certainly drained off energy, attention, and resources from meeting those challenges, and this development, this non-development, has fed back into the response to the sex abuse crisis because it has left many Catholics angry, frustrated, and distrustful. Second change in the context, the sheer rapidity of changes regarding gender and sexuality in our society has pitted the church against an increasingly dominant current of opinion, especially in the media. Outstanding, of course, has been the remarkable shift in American attitudes toward homosexuality and the legalization of same-sex marriage. Third, the election of Pope Francis and the emergence of a kind of civil war between well-entrenched forces for and against his papacy. It is not enough that all the tensions at play 20 years ago remain with us, all those issues that I listed a moment or so ago. But now contenders on each side of these issues are enlisting the sex abuse scandal to reinforce their cause and wheel it into action vis-a-vis Francis's papacy. Fourth, the globalization of the sex abuse scandal. Consider the treatment of children around the world. Physical punishment, human trafficking, sex tourism, child soldiers, child marriages, genital mutilation, patriarchal privilege. According to the World Health Organization data from 2014, more than 120 million children are sexually abused worldwide. We should be dismayed, indeed outraged, that such exploitation has touched the church as well. But can we be surprised? What has changed is not the abuse, but thank God the perception, the growing awareness and intolerance of it. What has changed is the perception of this corruption of religion, not as 1,000 discrete local stories, but as one story. Above all, as one story not about Islam or Hinduism or even Christianity, but about the one faith that is associated with institutional unity, Catholicism. Despite our often triumphalist boasting about that unity, in reality, 1.3 billion Catholics live in almost 3,000 dioceses with 5,100 bishops and act in hundreds of thousands of parishes and institutions and religious orders and movements. They may be united sacramentally and doctrinally, but they can be organizationally and administratively very independent, to say nothing of coexisting with vastly different cultures, economies, legal systems, and governing regimes. What the American church discovered in 2002 was what happens in Boston doesn't stay in Boston. What happens in Boston reverberates across the nation. Today, we are discovering that what happens in Chile or Australia or Italy or Nigeria or Poland reverberates in Boston, in Fairfield, in fact, across the entire world church. What is next? Last August, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania held a press conference and released an 884-page grand jury report that is still reverberating around the world. The Pennsylvania report did contain, as the New York Times headline put it, a catalog of horrors that filled me with shame, but not, as you can imagine or understand, surprise. In 2002, the papers had portrayed almost as graphically, but in fact with fuller human context and complexity, the shattering effects of priestly abuse. At their famous Dallas meeting, the bishops, in 2002, the bishops, like those at last February's Vatican summit, heard heart-rending accounts directly from victims. In 2004, the comprehensive study of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice concluded that between 1950 and 2002, 4,400 priests, 4,400 priests, between 4 and 5% of the Catholic clergy over those years had violated nearly 11,000 young people. If anything surprised me last August, it was the apparent ignorance of all this terrible, pain-filled history among so many Catholics, and not only younger ones. I also greeted the grand jury report with a professional awareness that no journalist can be handed an 884-page document and write a fact-checked report for the next day's paper or that evening's newscast. Virtually all the news stories that I saw were based on the report's sensational 12-page introduction. It was written in language the Pennsylvania Supreme Court later called incendiary. It highlighted 20 examples of particularly repulsive, grotesquely sacrilegious abuse. Especially noteworthy were the report's charges, not about the abusers, but about church officials. For over 70 years, the report stated all victims were brushed aside by church leaders who preferred to protect the abusers and their institutions above all. Or to sum it up as that introduction did, quote, priests were raping little boys and girls, and the men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all. Again, I was all too familiar with cases that deserved that description, especially before 1990. But that charge, simply on the face of it, struck me as highly dubious. How many of you have seen the Oscar-winning movie Spotlight? Those who haven't may want to plug their ears for the spoiler that's about to follow. Do you recall the moving scene when the Boston Globe has gone to press with the first of its exposés? All the newsroom phones start ringing. Calls from survivors of abuse from whom the burden of silence has now been lifted. It is a fact that a tremendous proportion of allegations were first reported to the church after 2002, allegations of abuse occurring long before, and after the Dallas Charter had mandated that molesting priests, regardless of how long ago their deeds and regardless of any treatment, should be removed from all active ministry and clerical identification. In Pennsylvania, no less than 30 to 40% of initial allegations only came from 2002 or after, no matter how much earlier the abuse. These victims were not brushed aside, but in many cases, in virtually all cases, heard, and in many cases, when they were desirous, assisted. The abuse was not hid, but reported to law enforcement. Their abusers, if still alive and active, were removed, not reassigned. What about the other 60 to 70%. So in one particular diocese where I painstakingly drilled down into the material in the grand jury report itself, I found that about 4 out of 41 cases clearly qualified as classic examples of victims being brushed aside and abusers protected and reassigned. That's 1/10 of the cases. Several other molesters were able to escape supervision by moving to other dioceses. But the rest, including the 30% in that diocese accused only after 2002, were anything but shuffled to other parishes. Most were promptly barred from ministry. Some between 1982 and 93 were sent for treatment, but there was no evidence suggesting that this was a ruse to hide wrongdoers. Not every diocese had as good a record, but as I pored over hundreds of cases, I was convinced that this diocese was not an outlier. True, the report's profiles were sometimes incomplete or ambiguous, but the gap between the carefully examined material and the report itself, to say nothing of the hundreds of pages of responses from the diocese, which the Attorney General's office merely appended without any apparent response, that gap was so vast that I felt confident in concluding that the report's charges, not against abusers, but against how church officials handled allegations, quote, are grossly misleading, irresponsible, inaccurate, and unjust. Now, I was well aware, so aware that my entire autumn was ruined by this project, that those conclusions run smack against the impressions that many people, especially many rightly appalled Catholics, had formed from the news stories. So I spent many, many weeks and 12,000 words in making my case, published in the January 25th issue of Commonweal that many of you have, and I don't know if there's some left in the back or not. I realized that many people needed to know the difference between a normal grand jury that decides whether or not to indict people and an investigating grand jury like the one in Pennsylvania that may name hundreds of people, church officials as well as predatory priests, yet indict no one. In the former case, innocence or guilt will be determined in a trial in which the accused are represented by counsel. Evidence and testimony can be examined and questioned, and a judge enforces rules designed to make sure that both sides have a fair say. An investigating grand jury, by contrast, hears and sees only what the prosecutor or attorney general chooses to provide. The jurors put their stamp of approval in the case of an 884-page report on something that they obviously did not write themselves or perhaps even manage to read. It is an old saw in legal circles that in legal circles that in the case of an ordinary, normal grand jury, any competent prosecutor could, quote, indict a ham sandwich. But that prosecutor acts in knowledge that the indicted ham sandwich will get its day in court. The findings of an investigating grand jury will never be so tested. Operating in virtually complete secrecy, it, or the Attorney General's office directing it, effectively counts itself not only investigator and prosecutor, but judge and jury as well. Its findings can only be challenged and tried in the court of public opinion. And I have to interject at this point that because of past history that has undermined the credibility of the Catholic hierarchy and even at least as important, or probably more important, their sense of pastoral duties toward survivors, that they are in no position to do the contesting in any effective manner. I confess to puzzlement when people demanding transparency and accountability in the church do not sound a peep in the face of a procedure as one-sided, unaccountable, and cloaked in secrecy as the Pennsylvania report. The Pennsylvania report is only one facet of the sex abuse scandal today. I didn't address who knew what and when about ex-Cardinal McCormick, or whether the Vatican, as a recent book charge, is full of gay prelates living, quote, double lives, or what new structures are needed to hold negligence or complicit bishops accountable. I fervently hope that the February summit at the Vatican will lead to progress on these many fronts. In the meantime, at least 15 other states, and even the Department of Justice, are launching their own investigations in the wake of Pennsylvania's. In principle, those investigations could be cleansing. They could help us find answers to still puzzling questions about the genesis and handling of abuse. They could empower more victims to come forward and get assistance. They could tell us whether the extensive educational vetting and auditing mechanisms that almost every diocese has put in place since 2002 have in fact worked as their audits seem to indicate. They could compare the experience of the church with other institutions like public schools, juvenile penal institutions, athletic programs, and summer camps to identify dangers and propose safeguards that would reduce the prevalence of this childhood plague, no matter where it may occur. They could. They could. But will they? I'm sorry to be skeptical. What are the incentives in terms of political ambition, media attention, public reaction, or legal blowback? There was a time when fear of offending Catholic voters or incurring the hostility of the church led political office holders, and attorney generals are almost all, I believe, elected political office holders, led such people to dodge abuse accusations against a priest, especially in strongly Catholic areas. That time passed quite a while ago. What is the likelihood that the media might become self-critical of its now ready-made narrative? The silence among my secular media colleagues in the wake of my Pennsylvania grand jury analysis is not encouraging. If the Pennsylvania model prevails, then the Catholic Church faces a drip, drip, drip for years to come, not only of accurate revelations of past crimes, sins, and failures, or of accurate revelations of a greatly reduced number of grave sins and crimes, but a distorting confusion of past and present, regularly enlivened with stories of abuse from around the world. It will all blur together. The media will not run out of articulate and genuinely aggrieved survivors protesting that the church has not changed or done enough. The hard-hitting first-rate plaintiffs' lawyers whose ads appear regularly seeking victims in the Wall Street Journal or at the top of almost any Googling search involving the church, they will not abandon their immensely successful business model. I believe that the damage to the church will be extensive. Fragility aggravated, losses magnified, public witness enfeebled, spiritual, intellectual, and imaginative heritage devalued. 37% of Catholics now tell the Gallup poll that, quote, as a result of recent news about sexual abuse of young people by priests, they have, quote, personally questioned whether to remain in the Catholic Church. And of course, the most questioning are the younger and already distanced or disaffiliated. Catholicism in the United States may well hunker down to a defiant, in general, traditionalist core. What will we do? Does any of that matter? I know many people asking themselves, isn't this simply a just punishment? But just to whom? Should we be resigned to this prospect? Should we actively resist it? And what would that mean? Is the church to be humiliated and afflicted by deceptive reports as well as by true ones? Wasn't Jesus, despite complete innocence, similarly humiliated and executed? But did the first Christians in their preaching and writings let the injustice of the religious and political authorities who condemned Jesus go unanswered? Questions like these have gnawed at me while poring over the Pennsylvania report, and then again in preparing these remarks during this penitential season of Lent. I was stung by all those readings about the sins of God's people, the prophecies of punishment, the sense of abandonment, the pleas for redemption. In fact, I find the first reading from the book of Hosea at today's Mass quite appropriate. Come, let us return to the Lord. It is he who has rent, but he will heal us. He has struck us, but he will bind our wounds. He will revive us after 2 days. On the third day, he will raise us up to live in his presence. Let us strive to know the Lord as certain as the dawn is his coming and his judgments shine forth like the light of day. He will come to us like the rain, and I think this particularly caught my attention, like the spring rain that waters the earth. I have worried that my efforts to correct the record in Pennsylvania might give consolation to those who still deny the church's sins, or it might add pain to those who suffered from them. The night my critique of the grand jury report was posted online, I sent an advance copy to a survivor I know well, fearful that he would first learn of it in some mangled or simplified summary. I know that we should be doing the obvious things I mentioned at the very beginning. I know that we should urgently address the many other challenges to Catholic vitality that have left a legacy of frustration and anger. But beyond that, I must conclude with questions, not recommendations. Not even these are posed with nervousness about their being misunderstood or misused. First, should we broaden our insistence on transparency? Transparency has considerable ways to go within the church. It appears even less present in the multiple state investigations now in the offing. How many times did the grand jury meet and for how long? How did the jurors examine 500,000 documents as their report claims? How did they approve 884 pages? Did they ever see the 400 pages of the church's responses? Sorry, the Attorney General's office told me, even these basic procedural matters are governed by secrecy. Even a minimum sense of fairness and transparency demands, it seems to me, that this issue be addressed. Second, should we widen our horizon of victims? Since the 2004 John Jay study reported 10,667 victims as of 2002, thousands more, largely from earlier years, have come to light, and it is generally agreed that all sexual abuse is vastly underreported. The total is also magnified always by indirect victims, family members whose relationships and hopes were shattered, parishioners now haunted by doubts and distrust, the vast majority of priests whose ministries and indeed their very persons now shadowed by suspicion and stigma. As the circle widens, there should be no equating of all the degrees of victimization or suffering. But I do wonder whether we should also include all those who stand to be deprived in the near or future or further future of the charity, moral compass, and sacramental life of Catholicism because of the toll taken by this scandal, both justly and unjustly. Are we responsible in some significant measure for those future indirect victims as well as past ones? And that brings me to the final question about our notion of accountability. Bishops should be accountable, but does accountability end with them? Are we accountable for informing ourselves beyond the headlines, for the vitality of the church 10 or 20 years from now? Do we ask accountability of the media or of public officials? In their valuable, though sometimes mechanical way, reporters seek alternative voices. They turn to the Survivors Network, SNAP, or Bishop Accountability, the keeper of a useful, although sometimes selective website. Recently, I have begun to contemplate the potential of a group called Catholic Accountability. It would consist of notable lay people, men and women, whose independence of mind is irreproachable, and perhaps with established reputations in relevant fields like law, criminal justice, psychology, child welfare, ethics, education, and ecclesiology. It would need to include individuals bridging the divisions in the church, and it might include non-Catholics as well. It would stand watch over all aspects of the Catholic scandal, over church and episcopal actions, and also over media reporting and judicial inquiries. It would issue statements and make its views available for reporters. It would welcome fair and useful public findings. It would criticize church leadership when called for. Perhaps it should be called not Catholic Accountability, but the Catholic Commission for Truth, Justice, and Healing. So in my ending is my beginning: listening, helping, healing, accountability, transparency, dialogue, compassion, prophecy, the obvious, also the true and the necessary. Plus the ability, as we focus on the scandal, to hold in our minds opposed ideas, or at least ideas in serious tension. Plus, too, a recognition of major changes, an increasingly fragile church, an abuse story gone global, a scandal now entwined with the conflicts of secular and religious factions, lobbies, quests for justice and personal vindication, financial interests, political ambitions, and larger agendas. The Pennsylvania report is the first of many. Where will they leave us, and how do we feel about their prospects? Should we simply suffer them or try to shape them? Do we need to broaden our insistence on transparency, our horizon of victims, our targets, and mobilization for accountability? Pope Francis warns that responding to the evil of sex abuse requires a conversion and change of heart, not just new protocols or programs. He has called for courage in confronting this scandal. I have tried to take that message to heart. Yet I worry that talk of converted hearts is so often talk of other people's hearts, in this case the bishops, but not our own. And I know that at least for someone in my place, it takes far less courage to chastise the bishops than to criticize the Pennsylvania grand jury report or my fellow journalists. For too long, the American bishops were trapped in denial, defensiveness, and inaction. But what about ourselves? Are we in denial or benumbed about what is coming next? Are our hearts too angry and too divided to do anything about it? I pray not. Thank you very much.
So now we have a brief response from Michelle Dillon, and then there'll be time, I'm sure, for a few questions or comments. So, Michelle.
Good afternoon. I want to first of all thank Professor Lakeland for inviting me today to be part of the conversation, and all the colleagues that were present in our earlier conversations today. We talked with great energy about a lot of big things, and I'm particularly honored to be asked to respond to Peter Steinfels, because probably Peter is not used to having people respond to him, so I won't take too much time. Thank you for your very thoughtful piece, both when it first came out in American Magazine, Commonweal Magazine, in Commonweal Magazine, but also then your further thoughts today. And I'd say there's not really anything in particular as such that I disagree with, so in that sense that makes it harder for me to respond. But I would say that all of those important points that you make about the role of the grand jury and the confidentiality and secrecy of the grand jury process, there is a lot of irony there, because everything you say is true, and the inability to be able to access the process and how the data were gathered and what was in those data. But I think it's the context for the grand jury reports and for all of these inquiries that we have to keep remembering. And that really is the failure of the church initially to be proactive in presenting the contrite face of the church and the honest face of the church. So going back, whenever we want to say history began with regard to the sex abuse crisis, so whether we, in recent memory, whether we take the 1990s, whether we go back to the Boston exposés in the early 2000s, or just going back to a year ago. And I think the church, if the church, even though it is open to learning, sometimes it doesn't learn, and what we see time and time again is it tends to stonewall and push back rather than coming out proactively on these issues and telling the truth insofar as one can talk about the truth. So that whole, if you like, the solemnity of silence and the language of the solemnity of silence, this is exactly the wording that, for example, Cardinal Brady, who was the Archbishop, the Primate of all Ireland a few years ago, he was investigated because as a young priest back in the 1970s, an up-and-coming rising star, he was the secretary to the bishop at the time, and he was investigating a 14-year-old boy who was claiming that he had been abused by a priest, of one of the infamous priests in Ireland who were accused of that, Brendan Smith. And at the time, Father Brady, who then became Cardinal Brady and then ex-Cardinal Brady, was the person who required him to sign a certificate of silence. And Cardinal Brady, when he was explaining why he did this, in retrospectively, he said that it was in order to add some solemnity to the proceedings. So he was effectively silencing the boy. It was sort of a ritual in his telling, a way of making it solemn. It was such an important thing that he told us that therefore it was best to keep it secret. And so this solemnization of the oath of secrecy seemed to be institutionalized in church practices, as we've seen, of course, in all of these cases, whether in Chile, whether in the US and elsewhere. Cardinal Brady also eventually did concede that the interview should never have been conducted. This was a couple of years ago. He conceded in such fashion. And he added, quote, "There was a shroud of secrecy and confidentiality with a view to not destroying the good name of the church." And so I don't think anyone is looking for revenge, but I think partly then why there is so much media exaggeration of the church's abuse itself, and why it is that so many people are willing to believe the media headlines about the church is because they have grown over time to be skeptical of the church and to have reservations about how it is that the church actually deals with these sorts of issues. So that's one thing that I would just bring attention to that. I like very much where Peter quotes F. Scott Fitzgerald saying that the ability to hold two opposing ideas simultaneously in mind and still function is a wonderful thing. That sounds to me very much like Catholicism, holding together faith and reason, holding together the multiplicities of our identities, which we increasingly have as Catholics and as Americans and as secular people. And I think this is what actually keeps the church strong. And so when we ask what's next, I would push back a little bit about the fragility of the church. I believe that the church maybe is stronger than fragile, despite and notwithstanding all of the hugely significant challenges that it is confronting and must confront. Because I think Catholics and church leaders themselves, at some level, as good Catholics more or less themselves, have to live both with the sin and with the promise of redemption. And so I think it's knowing that the church has sinned and sinned very badly, but hoping that we can have a little bit of contrition. And we've seen some little bit of contrition in some quarters at least. And even though many of us would also feel that a lot of that contrition has been uneven. But nonetheless, I think it's holding this, knowing that the church is imperfect and is systematically imperfect in how it conducts its institutional business, so to speak, and its pastoral life too, unfortunately. That nonetheless many Catholics, in terms of the laity and those who still call themselves Catholic, still want to believe in the possibility of a good church and of a redemptive church. And so while Peter notes that about 37% of American Catholics now tell Gallup that the sex abuse crisis has prompted them to think about leaving the church, what I see here are the 62% who are not thinking, or the 63% who are not prompted to think about leaving the church. And I'm not surprised, because Catholics for many decades, at least if we go back to the post-Vatican II era, as a sociologist, my historical consciousness is maybe less deepened than some of yours, but in the post-Vatican II era, we know that the distinctive thing about being an American Catholic is that you disagree with the church, whether it's on contraception, gay rights increasingly, women's issues. You disagree, but you still want to participate and be a committed Catholic. And so the sacramental life of the church, which often we forget about a little bit, because obviously, even as you mentioned, Peter, some of the sacrilegious things that occurred in the grand jury data about how the sacraments were abused in some of the sex abuse instances, make us, maybe some people, a little more distant from communion and the other sacraments. But we know from all our surveys and from interviews one-on-one with individuals, why do they stay Catholic? It's because they want to partake of the sacramental tradition and the larger doctrinal tradition which Catholicism offers people. And so it's this bifurcation, if you will, it's holding these two different ideas together, that you know the church is an imperfect institution and that many of the priests and many of the church officials are imperfect, but you still nonetheless want to go and receive the Eucharist and partake in all of its manifold things. And I think American Catholics are good at this. I think this is why American Catholics are so different from European Catholics and probably also from Latin American Catholics, which tend to be either or. Either you're in church and you agree with it, or you're out of church and you have nothing to do with it. Whereas the American sensibility seems to be able to do, as Fitzgerald says, to function more or less in a relatively good manner. Catholics have to do this because, as Peter also noticed, is the amazing changes in our culture over the last 20, 30 years, particularly as he identified with regard to issues of gender and gender ideology and sexual identity, and in particular, Americans' increasing acceptance, as well as, of course, the legal acceptance, but the cultural acceptance of the normalcy of LGBT plus relationships. So, as many know, there's a lot of American Catholics who want to be Catholic and live out and not be closeted about their sexuality. We also know there's a lot of American Catholics who are divorced and remarried. And one of the things that gives me hope for the future of the church and for it not to be as fragile as, or at least not to completely decline amid all of these challenges, is the way in which church officials globally have been dealing with some of these challenges. So while, again, there's a lot to be done and it's very uneven, but the Synod on the Family, for example, even though it reproduced the clericalism of the church, women weren't voting at it, it was only men and mostly bishops, nonetheless looked at the realities of secular life, looked at the realities of family life, and tried to do something to recognize that not all marriages follow right along what church teaching says marriage is, or at least a very narrow understanding of church teaching. And so for all of the unevenness of that synod, I would see it as a success because it showed the church in action, dealing with the current realities, dealing with the realities of family life, not necessarily changing doctrine in any formal way, and yet at the same time pushing along a different understanding of marriage and faithfulness and how it is that we can build a church that acknowledges the realities of family life. I think that's a model that can be easily applied, not maybe easily, but can be extended and applied to gay Catholics, cohabiting Catholics, and all kinds of other Catholics who feel marginalized and stigmatized by church teaching. So I think that model of church of dialogue, if the church would use that model more often, and use it effectively and improve upon that model by having lay voices, by having full voice of women, for example, and voting voices of women, which again were absent from the Synod on Youth and of course from the most recent Synod of the Bishops talking about sex abuse. These are ways that exist within the church structure as it is to try to move the church forward and to acknowledge the imperfections of church teaching as well as the imperfections of people's lives. So that's being optimistic. I'm positive about the church. You talk about Catholic accountability. I noticed you didn't mention any sociologists on that board, but that's all right. But I do think we have to have this conversation, as Francis says. You talk about contrition. You quote Francis on that. What I'm interested in his speech at the end of the Synod in February, which, and again, he could have used that speech, I think, to have talked about lots of other things, but at least towards the very end, he noted that this opportunity of the sex abuse is, it's an opportunity to turn the evil into an opportunity for purification. And yes, prayer and fasting and all of that is all very well, but I was particularly happy to see that he said that the holy, faithful people of God in its daily silence, in many forms and ways, continues to demonstrate and attest the stubborn hope that the Lord never abandons but sustains the constant and in so many cases painful devotion of his people. But he goes on, the holy and patient, now we know that the people of God are running out of patience, but the holy and patient, faithful people of God is at the center of the prophetic nature of the church, and it will be precisely this holy people of God who will liberate us from the plague of clericalism, which is the fertile ground for all these disgraces. So the Pope is still the Pope, whether people like him or not, or disagree with him or not, but I think this can give hope, can give a resource to activists, lay activists, priests, and others to take seriously this charge and say, what can we do with the people of God and as the people of God to move forward? So that's a positive note in one sense, except what gives me a little bit of pause on that is and it's really an accountability issue that Peter rightly raises, is that sometimes the laity are not as accountable as we should be. And we certainly see this in terms of survey data about how, for example, Catholics inform their conscience. Unfortunately, perhaps sociologically I'm impartial, but from a theological or pastoral viewpoint, it is perhaps regrettable that so many Catholics have little to do, for example, with reading official church statements. Because if they were to read papal encyclicals, if they were to read some of the statements of the bishops, they would find that there's a much more nuanced and beautiful and eloquent way of thinking about an awful lot of these issues. And that might help them to have better informed consciences. But whereas at the present, about 6% say that they read papal encyclicals. Most people rely on their family members and friends, and we know how that is. That's not necessarily informing your conscience. That's probably doing what you think you want to do anyway, not for everybody. So accountability, I think, is extremely important. So we shouldn't let the laity off the hook. We definitely have to include them. And I think the laity have an obligation to become more immersed, to become more owning of their relationship to the church, including taking seriously the church's teachings, even as they disagree with many of those teachings, but at least can have good arguments to argue back with. And then as a final thought, I would also say that, and most of our conversation today was talking about within the church, but it's another irony perhaps that I would see that part of the future of the church lies in serving secularism. As we know, the church, for long, church leaders have denounced secularism, even though Pope Francis himself, and it's a very Catholic thing not to denounce secularism, but to recognize that the God is in the secular, that, right, the Catholic imagination is about everyday life. Which I'm glad to see that Francis reaffirmed that. But we see that the problems in secular society, not problems about sex and gender, but problems about economic justice, environmental degradation, social justice more generally, these are global problems. They manifest themselves in different ways in different countries, but they're truly global problems. And the church has many resources, both doctrinal resources, but also local, parish, and other institutional resources that can be harnessed to make the church more relevant in these sorts of arenas, and therefore really serving the future of actually our civilization, even as the sex and gender issues will always, of course, be detracting from some of that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment, and it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes. Peter, do you want to come back to the podium? We have a few minutes for comments or questions. I have a microphone. Anyone first who wasn't at the morning session who would like to chip in? Otherwise, I'll pass it to one of the resident experts.
Not a comment, but a question. The bishops are going to meet, I believe, in July. The U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops. I think this is the next meeting that they have scheduled. What do you think is going to come of that meeting in terms of bishop accountability based on what they just went through in the past? They had a disagreement with the Vatican. Maybe that was communication. Maybe it wasn't. But they've got to come up with something, I think, in July in order to maintain their integrity, and I'm wondering if you think they will.
I didn't even know they were meeting in July rather than June. I'm no longer in this business of reporting regularly on the bishops, and in some ways I haven't the faintest idea of an answer. I assume that they feel the pressure of this issue of how our bishops themselves disciplined if they are negligent or even complicit in regard to sex abuse. A number of practical solutions have been floated. Cardinal Supich from Chicago, one, others. The problem, of course, is you cannot settle this for one nation alone. I take that back. You could make decentralize certain things and say different nations could have some different procedures, but on such an important thing like that, I think there'll probably have to be an international Vatican-led proposal. I think the American bishops will discuss that, press the Vatican. I'm rather hopeful on the basis of the talk that I was at on last Tuesday that Father Zollner from the Vatican suggested that in the wake of the February summit meeting, they would make progress on a concrete proposal for that. But I think if there's nothing that comes from Rome, the American bishops are unlikely to do anything except give some sense of their worry and kick the can down the road. That won't be good.
If we look at and listen to what you've said, the question that comes to mind is, what have we learned? And if we look at the present, what are dioceses and seminaries doing in the selection process to identify, improve upon what history has presented us?
Well, seminaries pardon me. I have no evidence that seminaries are going in a good direction. On the other hand, the selection procedure is a real problem because as the researchers from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice reaffirmed a week ago, there are really no clear indicators of that someone is a future likely sexual abuser that could be used to sort out people from the seminaries. I think the whole issue of discussion of human sexuality, of pursuing questions relating to a life of celibacy there have been some minor progress, but there's also, if I am to follow Sister Katharina Schutt, sociologist of St. Thomas University, who was also in town and who had worked with the John Jay College of Criminal Justice team and whose area is seminary education. I guess there's as much 2 steps backwards for every 1 step forward at the present moment. I'm not as sure that that is quite as critical, perhaps. I think we have to deal with the fact that priests are not playing the central role in working with youth that they once did, which of course is unfortunate in many ways, that there are not as many priests, and deal with the fact that the current data, which I think is good data, gathered by John Jay and now CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, shows that the level of predatory crimes by the clergy is very low. So I do think there's been tremendous progress made, but I'd leave it up to states' attorneys to question it in the process of background checks for everybody, not just priests, everybody dealing with youth in any church settings and programs, of educational programs for both parents and children about boundary issues, sex abuse, how to report it, and all those things. I think on that level, there's been real progress. On seminary education, I'm afraid that from what I see from some distance, I can't say that.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Michelle. It was just an anecdotal point, actually, I wanted to make, but it perhaps touches on your question of selection. But it was really about what we do in terms of lay accountability. What's our role in it? And I was working with a church, a Catholic church in the northeast of England, as you can perhaps tell from my accent. And it was an ecumenical cause which led me to work with this church. The priest, in this current climate, as you can imagine, the diocese are a little jumpy. And the priest they had discovered that he had been downloading pornography on the computer, whatever. And the priest had been removed from that community. The community themselves were very divided. Half of them were up in arms about this priest being removed because the priest was from their community. He had initially grown up in that area, and what came across was the sense of responsibility of those parishioners for the formation of that priest, their ability not to see him as some ontologically special person, but actually somebody who came from their community and somebody that they had a responsibility for the ongoing nurturing of that priest. And I thought it was an interesting anecdotal story of how we might think about our own accountability as lay people, not just in terms of reading encyclicals, but actually our responsibility to the formation of our own priests.
So just one or two observations. The first is I won't get just about the June meeting. I'm not sure I'm willing to get nervous until November. The June meeting typically is not attended by as many bishops and usually about setting the agenda for the November meeting when they all meet and vote on things. So when November comes, obviously the agenda is going to be rooted in a lot of this. But here's the thing that I wonder. 65% of bishops currently serving in the United States were named bishops after the Dallas Charter. I'm wondering if we're 3 or 4 years away. There's two things that I wonder. One is that if we're not 5, 6 years away from all of those who still struggle with life before the Charter in terms of accountability, in terms of not following the post-Charter world, if we're about 5 years away from a different episcopacy than we currently experience, is number one. And the other thing is, my concern is some of the younger, and this goes to your point about formation, some of the younger clergy that don't necessarily, they seem to come at their vocation less from an area of service and humility and more of an area of power and anger for a church that was never really their experience. But the way they dress, the way they communicate, the way they serve from a position of power is very concerning. And I'm wondering if that's not something that starts to drive people away as well.
Well, that raises a much larger issues about people feeling served by the church, within the church. I think your two questions are very good, and I'm very glad that they're two questions, because I think the question of the younger clergy, which is very complicated, is a very serious question. I'm worried that I can't answer that a lot of answers sometimes rest on stereotypes about younger clergy, but in my experience, some of those stereotypes seem to be accurate, but I'm no expert on that. And you distinguish that from your question about the younger bishops. And I think that's quite different. First of all, more and more bishops will be appointed by Pope Francis and recommended by leading bishops that Francis has appointed and vetted and so on by Rome. The whole question of the laity's role in that process has yet been taken on, which I think it should be. But I really do feel that the post Dallas Charter bishops have internalized the sex abuse scandal. I mean, there always can be some exceptions, but I think the Dallas Charter, which could be criticized as a protocol, a mechanism, it has led the way to a change of heart. It has become institutionalized, and it is, of course, all the more brought to the forefront of the bishop's thinking by all the public controversies. I have a couple of comments that may lead to a couple of other questions. One is the question, I thank Michelle very much for her response. Two of the points that she raised, one had to do with contrition, and the other one had to do with participation in the sacramental life of a number of other points she raised as well. In the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, as I said in my remarks, I really was taken aback by the ignorance of many Catholics, many well-educated, church-going Catholics about the whole history of the sex abuse scandal. I was sobered by saying something to a young Catholic journalist about the Dallas Charter, who reminded me that he was only a teenager then and wasn't even a Catholic. So, you know, I had my age thrown in my face, but still there were a lot of older people that I was surprised by. And I was surprised by something I have heard over the years often enough, that the bishops have never expressed contrition, sorrow, recognition of sin. It's just not true. The Dallas meeting at which I was present, at which Margaret O'Brien Steinfels was one of 3 lay people that got to run the bishops over the coals. The Bishop Wilton Gregory, now Archbishop of Atlanta, who was then the president of the Bishops' Conference, made his presidential remarks in the form, the traditional wording of the act of contrition, heartily sorry for all my sins, and so on. And there have been any number of ritual events in which bishops express sorrow and sin. Now, I have, working around this in my mind, this is a kind of failure of our bishops. That's not the kind of failure that ever makes it into a court trial. It's the failure that they did something, in my view, very significant in 2002, and that has gone on operating. But they didn't worry about telling that story, about getting the story, the history out there. And so that was one of their failings. Now, in regard to the second point, participation in sacramental life, I'm very much in one level in agreement with Michelle's remarks, but I'm troubled by the fact that I know we have 2, at least maybe 3 generations in which the regular participation from, you know, age 5 on till through adolescence and so on is already diminished. So people do not come to it with this habitual hunger or practice. They can be converted to it in sometimes very marvelous ways. But I see that as, you know, a real issue. Sunday soccer games have outdone regular church attendance for a large proportion of Catholics for a long time.
So thank you, Peter. I want to bring things to a close. Maybe we'll go back to F. Scott Fitzgerald for a second. So as you leave today, you will have in one hand the thought about contrition, and in the other hand, the beautiful evening you're about to enjoy. So thanks again to Peter and to Michelle, and thank you all for being here.